If you lived in a world where fear and suffering was constant, where you would go to bed every night not knowing if you'd wake up the next day, how much would you be willing to sacrifice to give your friends, family, and everyone else you care about but a moment of calm? To say that Final Fantasy X is a big deal is one hell of an understatement. Originally released in 2001, it was the final game in the franchise developed by Square before they had their merger with Enix. It's also often considered to be the last game in the franchise's golden age, since everything released after it would heavily depart from the classic Final Fantasy formula. With 8.5 million sales on the PlayStation 2, it's also the 5th best-selling game on the platform. And if you count total sales on all platforms, including the remastered version, it has sold over 20 million, making the game a huge financial success. So let's say you want to play Final Fantasy X today. Is it worth doing? That is the question we're going to answer today. Before we start, I need to make a small disclaimer here. I will be talking a lot about the game's bosses in this video, and since the names of several of them are massive spoilers, I will be using code names for the more sensitive ones. The codenames should be obvious enough for someone who has already played the game. The final boss, for example, would be called BFA. But if you can't figure them out, I will translate them for you in the description, so please don't read the last section of the description if you don't want spoilers. With that said, let's get this show on the road. Final Fantasy X is a game of extremes. It has undergone many significant changes compared to the previous installments, which is kinda understandable when you move to a completely new generation of video game consoles, and said changes are almost always either amazing improvements or huge steps back. One of the biggest changes in Final Fantasy X is the fact that the game is now fully voice acted. I would usually consider this a good thing. I personally think having voiced characters greatly helps with immersion, and if you have to sacrifice the quantity of dialogue you can include in your game in order to have it voice acted, it is often worth it. There are of course games where this doesn't work, usually ones where there is a lot of dialogue options, but generally voiced dialogue is superior in my opinion. The English voice work in Final Fantasy X is however really, really bad. Like, it's bad to the extent that it's almost funny. The really sad thing about this is that they've hired some genuinely amazing voice actors for this game. We all know that both John DiMaggio and Tara Strong are excellent voice actors, and they both play major characters in this game. The issues instead stem from the conditions under which the localization was done. The localization team was unable to make any changes to the cutscenes and therefore had to perfectly match the length of the translated lines with that of the Japanese dialogue. You might not think that this sounds like too much of a problem. After all, this is how dubbing all movies works, right? Here's the thing. If your dubbed line of dialogue becomes a bit too long in the movie, it might look a bit stupid. If the dubbed line of dialogue becomes too long in Final Fantasy X, it will straight up crash the game. These issues also weren't communicated properly by Square to the localization team, and if I'm going to guess, the devs probably didn't even know this was going to be a problem. And as a result of this, basically the entire script had to be rewritten on short notice, and a lot of voice lines had to be re-recorded with a focus on hitting the time slot rather than a good delivery. By this point, the project was nearing its deadline, and the end result speaks for itself. Now I know what you're all thinking. Can't you just play the game with Japanese voices instead? No, you can't. At least not unless you mod the game, so this is what we're stuck with.
He may be a blitzball whiz kid, but up against fiends, he's a newbie.
Not a guardian then. I just want him nearby.
What?
What? What do you mean?
It's just that, well...
We're all going to the temple anyway. Can't this wait till later?
Another big change comes from the game's linearity. There is no longer an overworld. Instead, you walk down what's essentially a corridor, fighting monsters through random encounters, and occasionally you find secret items hidden away in some corner. After walking for a while, you will eventually get to some story point, where the story moves forward, and if you're lucky, you might even get a boss fight. Normally, I wouldn't have any issues with this. There's absolutely nothing wrong with a well-structured linear experience. The issue comes from when the game occasionally throws various elements of non-linearity at you. Roughly a third into the game, there is a point where you have to backtrack all the way to the start to pick up recordings left behind by the previous group that went on the same journey you do. There's nothing forcing you to do this, you can just move on with the story if you want to. But since a lot of character development of some very important characters is presented almost exclusively through these recordings, I would consider doing this more or less mandatory. When I did this, it took me a bit over an hour to do, and I ran away from every single fight I stumbled upon on the way there. If you were to actually fight all the monsters you encountered, it would take several times longer than that. Backtracking can work when a game is designed around it, but when your game is completely linear like this, it just doesn't. There's further non-linear stuff to do near the end of the game when you get the airship. You are now free to travel to any point of the map with some minor restrictions, and there is a ton of stuff for you to do. I'm gonna be real with you guys. This game has by far the worst side content in any Final Fantasy game I've played. It feels more like an afterthought quickly slapped onto the game at the end of development, rather than a well thought out and rewarding part of the game. It's all extremely grind heavy, and as with the earlier backtracking segment, the game world just isn't designed with this type of content in mind. The trend of adding this stupidly grindy stuff for the player to do at the end of the game started in Final Fantasy VII, and it's just not fun. Unfortunately, you're kinda forced to do it a bit in this game as well, since the final boss fight is so goddamn hard. That in itself isn't a bad thing, and the encounter itself is really good. I just wish they could have replaced all the grindy bullshit with fun, interesting dungeons, like the ones they have as optional content in the Super Nintendo games. Instead, we are left to grind for money, crafting materials, levels, and various other things. No matter which side activity you want to do, the task at hand is almost always the same. Just go out and grind random encounters. The grind itself is made even worse by the fact that the random encounters are quite bad. This is a whole aspect of JRPGs that developers still haven't really managed to implement well, but this is one of the least fun implementations I've ever experienced in an otherwise good game. In essence, it's just a game of rock, paper, scissors. Waka will counter flying stuff, Tidus will counter fast stuff, Riku will counter robots, Auron will counter armored stuff, Lulu will counter magical stuff, Yuna will heal you, and Kimahri can do whatever the hell you want him to. If you use the right character against the right enemy, it will go down in one attack. If you use the wrong one, you will either miss or do an extremely low amount of damage. That's it. That's the lion's share of all the random encounters in the game. Later on, the game fortunately starts throwing more interesting enemies at you with fun and varied mechanics, but it never stops sending the standard boring rock, paper, scissors enemies between. Now, I kinda appreciate what they tried to do here. They tried to turn what in many JRPGs is just a case of you starting the fight and one-shotting everything immediately into something more interesting. But you're still just one-shotting everything. The only thing they achieved here was making the combat slower, which is not what I would call an improvement. There are of course other side activities available for us as well. Ever since Final Fantasy VII, various minigames have been a staple in the franchise, and these make a return here as well. The big one is Blitzball, and I have to give them this one thing. It's actually a pretty good game. I'm hilariously bad at it, so I'm not going to go deeper into it, but I can't deny that it's good. The same can't be said about the Chocobo games. Well, I am hilariously bad at those as well, but that's not what I'm getting at here. The Chocobo minigames are the worst side activities in any Final Fantasy game ever, by an absolutely huge margin. They are downright unplayable, and I quite frankly don't even understand how this made it through development without being cut from the game completely. Words aren't enough to do these games justice, so I'm just gonna show some of it for you. Now, after hearing me angrily complaining about this game for over 1500 words, you all probably think that I hate it. Here's the thing. That couldn't be further from the truth. So I think it's time to stop the whining and start to talk a bit about what this game does well. Unlike the random encounters, the boss fights are absolutely brilliant. This game has some of the best and most well-designed boss fights of any single-player RPG I've ever played. The sheer variety in the mechanics is quite frankly insane, and almost every single fight has a gimmick that makes it interesting. In one fight, we for example fight S while standing on a big airship. Apart from the normal attacking and healing, we can also give orders to the airship to move closer or further away from the boss. If we are far away, we can avoid some of its attacks, but we are also limited to only attacking with ranged attacks. So we have to adapt our strategy to what the boss is doing, staying close when it's doing normal attacks, and moving away when it charges up the more powerful ones. But the best fight of them all is the fight against Ly. I will go over this fight in a fair amount of detail now. I will not be spoiling any story elements, but if you don't want to know how to kill it, I will give you a timestamp so you can skip this part. I wouldn't worry about it though, since figuring out how to implement the strategy is where the difficulty lies, not in figuring out what the strategy is, and that is something you can only learn by actually fighting the boss yourself. Anyways, you have been warned. Timestamp on the screen. The fight itself is divided up into 3 phases. In the first phase, she will counter all physical attacks with blind, and all magical attacks with silence. Since these status effects prevent you from using said types of attacks, you need to get rid of them before you can attack again. She will combine this with doing normal attacks on you, so you also have to make sure that you heal your party whenever people get too injured. In the second phase, she starts turning up the heat a bit by casting Zombie on everyone in your party. Zombie makes your characters count as undead, which means that any healing spells cast at them will start to deal damage. Of course, she will also start to cast healing spells as your party to take advantage of this status effect, and this does significantly more damage than her normal attacks do. Now, you might think that the best way to solve this is simply to remove the zombie status, but if you remove it on everyone in your party, the boss will immediately reapply it again. So you always need to keep the zombie effect on at least one person at all times. This will, however, only work until you get to phase 3. Ly will open this phase by casting Death on your entire party. Now, you might remember that I said that the zombie effect causes your characters to count as undead. This also means that it makes you immune to the death spell. So now you have to keep the zombie effect up on everyone while dealing with her onslaught of healing spells without having the ability to restore health on any of your characters, because if you remove the status effect from anyone, she will just instantly kill them. I will leave it up to you guys to figure out how to actually solve this situation and suffer through the fact that there is a 5-minute unskippable cutscene before the fight. A cutscene that you're going to get way too familiar with. My recommendation is that you take this time to go to the bathroom or make yourself a cup of coffee. Since the game is turn-based, you won't have to worry about the fight starting without you. But putting up with this is worth it, because this is one of my favorite fights in any video game ever. If I'm going to complain about anything when it comes to the boss fights, it's that a couple of them are a bit overtuned. This is especially applicable to 2 of the fights against SG. and it is advisable to stop and grind some levels before both of these fights, but this is really nitpicky of me to complain about, especially since I'd much rather play a game with fights that are a bit too hard than a game with fights that are too easy. Of course, all of this can be circumvented by cheesing the fights with Yuna's summons. The SG fights try to counter this by one-shotting the summons one turn after you use them, but you only need one turn to unleash their overdrive, so this doesn't really matter. So maybe don't do this, it kind of ruins the boss fights, and I really think they have to be experienced properly because of how good they are. There have also been some quite significant changes to the fundamentals of how the combat works as well. In the Super Nintendo and PS1 games, the series uses what has become known as the ATB system, which creates something that's kind of a mix between turn-based and real-time combat by limiting how long you can spend on each turn. In Final Fantasy X, the combat is purely turn-based with no time limits for your turns, but instead you are shown in which order the various characters will act next. It is extremely important to take this in mind because many encounters are heavily based on you being proactive rather than reactive with your actions. The party you use also isn't fixed. The game allows you to keep 3 people in the fight at the same time, but you're free to switch them out with any of the inactive characters at any time without wasting a turn. This system has both strengths and weaknesses compared to the ATB system. I miss how the old system kind of forced you to act quickly, and this led to your actions not always being optimal. But the new system does allow for the combat to have a much greater tactical depth, and a lot of the great boss encounters really wouldn't work if you didn't have time to plan your actions. Another thing this game really nails is the story. The story follows our protagonist Tidus, or Tidus, or however the hell you want to pronounce his name. Tidus is a Star Blitzball player in the city of Zanarkand who is transported to the world of Spira after getting attacked by a mysterious monster. Spira has a problem. The world is under constant attack by a gigantic fish monster known as Sin, the same creature that caused us to be transported to Spira in the first place. The existence of Sin can be felt through every part of Spiran society. Everywhere we go, we see huge ruins from ancient societies, and it is obvious that the world used to be a lot more developed than it currently is. Outside of the 2 major settlements, there are only small villages, since Sin is drawn to large gathering of people, and these 2 cities are only kept safe because Yevon, the religious authority that rules the world, dedicates significant military resources to their safety. Yevon teaches that Sin was sent to Spira to punish mankind for their reliance on machines, and as a result of this, the technology of Spira is extremely primitive. Apart from machines left over from the past and the small group of Albed outcasts, everything basically operates at the medieval level. It is in this world we are introduced to Yuna, the secondary main character. Yuna is a summoner, a group of people who dedicate their entire lives to defeating Sin. 10 years prior, her father Braska became the latest in a long line of people to succeed with this and bring calm to Spira. The thing is that this calm is short-lived. Sin always returns. So now the next generation of summoners have to go out on their own pilgrimages to defeat Sin. And maybe, if we adhere to the teachings of Yevon, the calm will be permanent this time. This is all done with the help of Yuna's guardians, who are the fighters tasked with helping the summoners achieve their goal. We have Waka, a blitzball player and deeply religious person. Lulu, the black mage of the group and former fiancé of Waka's late brother. Kimari, a warrior of the cat-like Ronso people. He is the most mysterious member of the group, and we never really get to learn that much about him. But it's obvious that he has a much closer relationship with Yuna than any of the other guardians. We also have Auron, who previously worked as a guardian for Yuna's father. Finally, we have Riku, a girl from the Albed, a tribe of outcasts that reject the teachings of Yevon. The story is presented in a fairly linear fashion, putting a heavy focus on the theme of sacrifice. The journey that we're on requires a great deal from everyone involved, and it's going to take a heavy toll on everyone, both physically and mentally. The cast of characters is colourful and well developed. Everyone gets a proper character arc throughout the story, and no one feels redundant. There are many RPGs out there that fall into the trap of having characters in the party that tag along for the ride just because, without any real reason for doing so, but this definitely isn't the case here. Everyone has clear motivations for why they are going on the journey, although for some members of the party it takes a while before we start to properly understand what those motives are. The entire party is also present at all times, which helps them feel important. In previous Final Fantasy games, and RPGs in general, you're usually free to pick from a large cast of characters, which greatly limits the importance of them. Since the games can't know which ones you bring for specific parts, they are often relegated to the background. This is not the case in Final Fantasy X. Instead, everyone gets to shine. Tidus, while annoying at times, works really well as a main protagonist. Just like the player, he's not from Spira and therefore has no idea how anything works. So the world building happens quite naturally, as Tidus himself finds out more and more about how Spira works. It's a classic way of handling things, and it's something people do for a reason. Tidus being new to the world also shows in the dynamics of the party. He's very much treated as a stranger by the rest of them, and initially Yuna is the only one who actually trusts him. There are also strong bonds between the remaining characters of the party who all know each other way better than know Tidus, and even towards the later part of the story, it's clear that Tidus doesn't really fit in here. Final Fantasy X is a fairly major departure from the previous titles when it comes to the way it looks. The older Final Fantasy games are generally heavily based on the Western world in their visuals. This can be seen in the classic medieval look of the 2D games and Final Fantasy IX, the German-inspired villages of Final Fantasy VII, and Dealing City in Final Fantasy VIII, which is basically just Paris. Final Fantasy X instead borrows more from Asia. The main visual style is initially that of the Pacific Islands, but once you get to the mainland, it shifts to a more Southeast Asian style, with the design of the temples borrowing heavily from the various religions of the area. This gives Final Fantasy X a very unique look compared to the other games, especially since the series went back to the more Western-inspired settings in the following games. It really makes the game stand out visually, and this is a welcome change in my opinion. From a technical point of view, it looks alright by the standards of today. It's cartoony enough in its style, and it has aged fairly well, and the HD remaster does upgrade the graphics quite a bit. If you played the original version, it is one of the best looking games released on the PS2, which is quite impressive considering how early in the console's lifecycle the game came out. When it comes to the music, I'm both disappointed and satisfied. The soundtrack itself is good. There are even a couple of tracks, like the main theme of the game, that are downright masterpieces. But when I'm playing a Final Fantasy game, I expect my soundtrack to be more than just good. The standard the older games have set is ridiculously high, and Final Fantasy X really doesn't manage to reach that same level. But I can also understand that. It is a level that is next to impossible to reach, and I'm honestly kinda amazed that they managed to keep the quality as high as they did for as many games as they did. Sitting here reading through all this stuff I've written, I realized that I've basically been spending all this time just shitting all over this game, which feels really wrong for me. I absolutely love it. It is one of the most gripping and touching stories I've ever experienced, and I guess this is a large part of why this video has become so negative. The story is the main reason for why I love it, but it's also really hard for me to convey what makes it good without spoiling it all to you. So despite all the negativity that this video has been filled with, I implore you, play this game. It is worth it. It has its issues, but they pale in comparison to the things the game does well. After all of this, my final score is probably going to surprise a lot of you. I give this game a 9 out of 10. Thanks for watching everyone, and don't forget to like, comment and subscribe for more videos like this one. After this, I really need to tackle something smaller. This game was way too big for me, and despite this video being my longest one yet, I feel like there were a lot of things that I want to say that just didn't make it into the script in the end. My original plan was to make the next video about Fallout 2, but I'm starting to have serious second thoughts about that, because that is also a huge game that's going to be really hard to properly cover.